welcome to Changing Shapes. Today, Felix Rossknecht. So good to have you here. Felix, you've spent your career growing businesses across an impressive range of sectors, and I've always admired the depth of your expertise. Could you begin by introducing yourself?
Of course, yeah, like you mentioned, I grew up in a family business, so somehow I've always had it in me to work on growing businesses. It's been quite a mix of small and large ones from a bunch of different sectors, including e-commerce, consumer tech, and a little bit of B2B, but I've really mostly focused on the consumer side of things. So I'm also very interested in how we behave as people and what kind of influence that has on companies and how they decide to grow. So I've done various pieces of consulting work and had a couple of agencies, and currently mostly working with a mix of startups and corporates, but primarily around go to market, growth strategy, and consumer insights.
Well, and you've always been on the cutting edge of innovation with all things. Whenever we've chatted in the past, is you've always been pointing me in new directions of new things evolving. And we've recently been talking about AI and startup development. So that would be an interesting place for us maybe to start our conversation today. So how do you, I mean, in that space of AI and startup development, how do you see generative AI tools transforming the way startups build products and services? And what would you say is the main benefit of using these tools?
So much is happening, and it's kind of hard to know whether in a month this will still be relevant, right? Maybe looking back the last couple of months, whether so much has already changed that maybe I'm already behind the curve again. But I would say it's still early days. There's obvious shifts happening, and people are experimenting with various different tools. The impact will be enormous. I think there's going to be a lot of changes in the future. Just practically speaking, the ability to especially prototype and sort of ideate and validate tools, any kind of platforms, even not from the marketing perspective when it comes to just sort of visual representations of your brand, your product. It's just becoming so much easier to test. And in a way, it's, these are generational shifts. It sort of happens quite often that, for example, they use software development used to happen over a year or two. And then you take it to some company's servers to install it. And then maybe it takes another year or two until you get some feedback from them. And I mean, I wasn't around during those times, but shifting that towards a SaaS model where you could make changes and instantly get some results. And what we're seeing now is the next generation of that, where there are platforms that allow you to do product testing on synthetic audiences before you even take it to the customer. So it's almost a sort of pre-testing happening based on AI technology. So especially this phase of quickly getting customer feedback on your ideas, on your prototypes and the initial products is getting so much faster. And there's still a lot of challenges to understand what the customer's needs are, how you could potentially address them, how you can then distribute the product, take it to market, grow, etc. So it's not like it's all going to get incredibly easy and automatic, but especially around that phase, which a lot of companies struggle with, is validation. Things become so much more visual very quickly now, which makes it a lot more effective.
It's a really good point, and I think it's so interesting that you have this change of things getting so much faster and more efficient, and to find that balance. One of the things that I've observed is that AI is incredibly empowering for people to do so much more themselves. You can get code written, like you said, you can get prototypes written. I love the idea of testing on a synthetic audience and just validating and learning quickly. But how would you go about recognizing when you need an expert to have their input, right? There's so much I can do myself in areas where, for me, of not being an expert in graphic design or I'm not a coder, there's things that I can get done that I couldn't do before. But what is your methodology of knowing, you know what, now comes the point where I need a real expert to have a look at this or to give their input?
I mean, it depends who you talk to, right? Because I've spent a lot of time working with very scrappy early startups where the answer is probably a bit sooner than they think. And then I've done a lot of work with major corporates big publishing companies, big financial houses, and there it's probably a lot less a lot later than you would expect. So it really varies by audience, right? Ultimately, I keep the startup hat on primarily, and I would say that you can be scrappy for so much longer these days, and the image generation models getting so much better. So yeah, come up with some ad creative, and come up with some initial designs, and at least use it as a foundation. If you get stuck, then it might be a good time to bring in an expert. But for what sorts of help, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be for execution help. It could be for more of an advisory role where people give their judgment or their sort of recommendation for what works, what doesn't work. I mean, it depends a bit on the exact task it would be, right? If it's design versus maybe security or the sort of technical infrastructure. And then, I mean, the one warning is that there's a top-down approach here too, where the bigger the potential risks that you're exposed to, the more careful you might want to be, right? So as you mentioned, I've been doing more work in health tech recently, and obviously when it comes to people's health, there's a lot of precautions we have to take to, not accidentally cause people issues by some kind of technical bug or an AI hallucinating. And I know that's getting a lot of attention, obviously, and probably getting a lot better. But can you work your way backwards from the top and think, how big are the risks of getting certain things wrong? And what are these areas where I need to be particularly careful? And then it's, of course, worth investing a bit extra to make sure that everything works well. If we're talking your standard consumer product or entertainment product, etc., then is it going to cause that much of an issue if something doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to? Probably not. It's worth being more scrappy around that. But some areas are just higher risk, and equally, I suppose, some areas are big reward as well. So if you're working on a major opportunity, then it might be worth investing a little bit extra and getting it right. But again, with that one, I'd be careful because it's always better to just prove something on a smaller scale anyway, and get there as quickly as you can. Just have to be realistic that some bigger brands have their reputation on the line, and they need to be particularly careful with that.
And so that's really interesting. And I think kind of double tapping on our collaboration with AI, it is right now as bad as it ever is going to be, and it'll keep getting better, and the tools will get more powerful and change the way we work. And you've mentioned to me offline that you've been using tools to experiment with product building, and I wonder, even if not asking this from a technical point of view, but more from a cultural or social point of view, do you think AI could be considered effectively as something like a co-founder or a key decision maker in a startup? Are we ready for that? And how does that change our thinking about how we run startups and businesses?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it in that framing, but if you think about AI taking on certain roles as opposed to entire jobs or people's outputs, then definitely that's already happening. That some of what a co-founder might provide, the AI is already doing. And in my case, at least, I use ChatGPT a lot as a thinking partner, if you want to call that, or whether that's coming up with some of my own hypotheses or ideas around a certain space and then just throwing it in and seeing what it comes up with. I mean, these tools usually try and be very supportive and helpful. So it takes some digging for them to really find some holes in your argument, but it can be done. Expressing how you think about something forces you to really think deeper. And in that sense, sometimes you would have a co-founder take that sort of role. And I'm not saying I would completely replace someone, but it, it's just a lot easier to do a lot more thinking work with one of these tools rather than always taking up your co-founder's time. But
Yeah,
of course, there's lots of other factors there that still I'd rather have certain conversations with a human than with the AI.
I think that's an interesting point, though. For me, I use GPT in a similar way, maybe to you, is, one, getting out of my own head. Sometimes I use physical writing and getting it on a piece of paper. Sometimes I need something that's feeding back to me. And it does reduce the barrier of entry where there's just this thought in my mind. and I need to have a conversation with someone to even just formulate it myself, and that's helpful. But I also love working with humans who I haven't figured out a way for ChatGPT to call bullshit on one of my ideas, right? To just say that's just downright wrong. One of the other effects of this is that we have to train ourselves to know what kind of a collaborator we're working with, because the hallucinations are getting a little bit less obvious. And it recently told me that Shopify is creating an AI tool for their customers that to me sounded new, and I feel like I would have known about it. And so I did a quick Google search to verify, is that true? Couldn't find anything. And when I double checked with GPT, well, where did you get that information? It said, oh, it was a hypothetical idea based on the subject we're talking about. Where I'm like, well, it's not useful. And I wouldn't want that in a co-founder. It would be horrible to work with a human who does that to you because you take
You
what
still
they
get
say
that
for
in a
granted. You
co-founder
still
though,
get
right?
that. For me, it happens twice and then it doesn't happen again because I can't work like that. But it's training us as entrepreneurs to know what areas to use these tools in, I think. And I wonder, have you found a way how to get it to stop being such a people pleaser, or are you in the same boat as me that you just have to take it for what it is?
No, I have. I had quite a deep experience lately where you essentially ask it to give you a set of advice in the style of a sort of tough love that a friend would give you, who really cares about you, who's comfortable to be really honest with you because they have your best interest at heart. And they will also point out things that maybe you might want to focus on more, or you just have to get on with it that you're putting off. And it was incredibly good because it has the memory function, right? And I use it a lot. So it knows a fair bit about how I think and how I plan my work, what kind of questions I'm asking myself, where am I a bit insecure about what to do, these kinds of things. So that thread ended up being enormously long because there's so many other questions you could ask, and it kept that attitude up for the entirety of it to be helpful, but a little bit, pointed as well at times, saying, well, you just really need to just get on with this bit. So there's ways of doing it for sure. It's not the default, but there's there's ways to get around it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm still not quite happy enough. I want mine to not be so afraid of offending me. That's what I value so much in the humans I talk to, that they won't be afraid to say, to call me out. And mine still, I haven't still figured out how to brief it well enough to be quite like that. But yeah, I'll keep experimenting.
Well, and I suppose it's also about our attitude towards a tool versus our attitude towards a human co-founder, where when it comes to accountability, it's still much more effective to really feel responsible for someone else's livelihood as just as much as yours if you're running the same company. And you probably wouldn't have that with a tool in the same way. I mean, if you spend long enough with it, maybe it will get there, but that's still a factor that definitely stay there.
That's true. That's true. Well, in terms of collaboration, moving on to another subject where you're a subject master is AI and marketing and advertising. Starting off as a marketer, are there menial tasks that you're really excited about handing over to an ever patient AI?
So many. And just to be sure, this has already been happening for quite a while, right? So we tend to forget that I think Google search ads first started in 2000 or something. So it's been it's been almost 30 years, 25 years plus, where AI tools have started taking on marketers' jobs. And now it's obviously becoming a bit more talked about in that way, but it's already happening. So, compared to having a team of media buyers in an agency, what you do now, what we've got to is you run digital ads. You basically just put a credit card on the platform and it will do the rest, more or less. It's not far off. You will maybe upload some creative assets, but even that could be generated on the platform. It will find the best audiences. The more you leave it alone, the better it will work. And that's AI, right? It's not an LLM, but this is an AI that has taken, I don't think it's taken a lot of jobs. It's just taken a lot of tasks and roles from people working in agencies, and that will continue, right? So I think the current frontier, what I've seen the most work in, is around influencer marketing, which is still quite a manual job in a lot of ways. There's now platforms that you can use to identify the right influencers and creators to work with, but it's still a lot of manual outreach and negotiation. And now there's some essentially AI agents being created that specialize on influencer marketing that will automatically find the right people to reach out to, then do the outreach, deal with the responses and the questions, set up the deals, obviously automatically track any kind of results from their campaigns to send them rewards or commission incentives, whatever it might be. And that is much more effective than doing it manually, and also more interesting for the people who were doing that manually to then focus on doing something different, right? I mean, that's the whole fear setting here of people will lose their jobs has not been happening. I suppose it's never really happened, and the marketing industry will always soak up a lot of people because it's an opportunity for people to bring some creativity into what might otherwise be slightly more tedious, boring office work, right? So there'll always be people doing it, but they might be doing different tasks. It might ideally become more about ideation and getting to know your customers better, or doing in-person events. Maybe that will have the big revival soon. But yeah, there's certainly still quite a bit that can be outsourced or automated to AI.
Good to hear that you see the evolution of the sector not necessarily diminishing, because that was, as you said, it's been happening for such a long time, and these changes have been happening for such a long time. My natural question would have been, are there just less and less people working in the sector, or is the work changing? And I don't get the feeling from when I talk to you that there's necessarily a lot less work to do. It's just different kind of work. So that's very reassuring. As this efficiency increases and allows for highly personalized content, how would you say brands should balance this power with ethics, right? Because you can, as these AI tools can generate more and more targeted ads, you could see a future where it's just every individual who's seeing an ad sees something that's highly targeted specifically for them, creating content that wouldn't exist otherwise. Do you see there a concern in the balance between that power and ethics, or would you say that it's already happening with the types of content we create and the level of targeting that we get?
In a way, we've backtracked a little bit on that already the last few years, where privacy regulations just became so much stronger, in that personalization became more difficult in certain ways, especially over the last, I suppose, 5, 8 years, I would say. It's hard to say how that will continue, right? Because on one hand, I think regulators are on the game, and there's certainly more public pressure on companies as well to be stricter with data privacy. But then the technology will, of course, make it more viable to have much more personalization. Different people have different attitudes towards this, right? There's no fixed rule book or set of ethics, and for one person, it might be incredibly invasive piece of content based on their behavior. For someone else, it might be incredibly useful, tailored advice for them, what they might want to consider purchasing or signing up for to help them with their life. There's always going to be an ambiguity, and companies will have to deal with that. But realistically, most companies can't influence what's allowed, what's not allowed, what's acceptable. It's a market, it's a competitive market. So you're mostly a taker when it comes to these things. To be honest, my advice usually for entrepreneurs and business people is focus on products that you genuinely believe have a positive impact on people's lives longer term. And then just do whatever you can to get it out to the right people. And I'm not saying you should cut corners and do dodgy things and break the law to get your product out. It's not purely the ends justifying any means, but if at least your product is adding value and you can make sure that your company is succeeding, then yeah, this is what we need to focus on, rather than trying to be ethical at promoting products that don't really help anyone anyway and are not adding that much value, which in my view, is sort of the wrong discussion. And then, we let other people deal with that. But as entrepreneurs and strategists, I think that's a better focus, because once you get political in building businesses, I think you're having an even more difficult time, because then it just adds so much complexity. And I think companies need to focus on helping people solve their needs in a way that is ethical, of course, and legal and appropriate, but just focus on the right problems, I would say.
I was wondering, from your perspective, a question around friction and efficiency. So I come from at this from two perspectives. As somebody who worked in the creative space, both in the art sector as well as in advertising, but now as an entrepreneur running tech businesses, I see it from both sides. I get excited about how these LLMs can increase efficiency, make things faster, more A/B testing, and really bring in a lot of speed. But at the same time, as I'm getting more and more excited about it, I think, well, but friction isn't always a bad thing. And from the art perspective, the best things that I've ever created as an artist were those that had the maximum amount of friction and that really were extremely difficult to create. And I think most things that we admire in the art sector came from a point of friction in some way or another. Now, obviously, those two worlds are very different, but do you see in the space of marketing and entrepreneurship, is there room for friction being a good thing? And if so, how do we know when it would help to have some friction to improve results?
It's definitely sometimes too easy already to get exposure or distribution. And, I think digital ads are still the prime example there, which on one hand, of course, is an incredibly powerful tool. And it's made the advertising industry a lot more efficient, I would say, overall. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know, but it has. But on the other hand, if maybe a product isn't at the stage yet where you just want to put more fuel on the fire because you already know the direction it's going, then of course it can be too easy to just put some money on ads and you know pay to get people using your platform, which of course it's not that easy. You could still very easily put the money on it, nothing happens, because the ad doesn't speak to the person's problem. It doesn't really clearly reflect what you're trying to do, what you're trying to solve. But of course, that is one example where in certain stages of product development, it's useful to move slower and to do things that don't scale, right? I mean, that's what everyone recognizes. So I suppose it just becomes something that people have to be even more disciplined about in the future. Now that it becomes even easier to, get quick results, you could just ask an AI what it thinks of your new product and come up with a whole bunch of positive feedback about why it's great. And that might be useful, but it might also not be true. And I think we need to be careful again where friction is useful and where it's not useful, right? So what I've also seen a lot is companies trying to reinvent the wheel in areas where they just need to follow the best practice, and then focus on other areas where you have to be unique. So practically speaking, when it comes to most consumer products these days, especially the whole e-commerce world, for example, it became so ubiquitous to be able to buy pretty much anything online on various different platforms was not a competitive advantage anymore. It was just a distribution channel, really. So you had to focus on the product. I mean, that applies to any company, but there were certain times, there's certain times where new technology opens new distribution channels, whether that's just Shopify being available, for example, made it so much easier for anyone to do this. But in the beginning, it was an advantage. So you could just, sell a product that's not differentiated because it's so much easier to buy online versus going into the store. And it might be similar for, when certain apps were first made possible through the technology. But always very quickly, it comes down to your product and your positioning doing the heavy lifting for you versus what growth channels should I use if I have between 10 and 100,000 dollars per month to spend, it's pretty obvious. People have cracked it. It will change every couple of years, and it's good to keep an eye on it, but it's relatively standardized. What your page should look like, you know, on try and be creative in those areas, but do be creative when it comes to your positioning, actually something that is adding something new to the market. And I think that will continue to be the case, just with different technology examples in the future.
So one thing, in terms of things changing every few years, one thing that I've been dying to ask you about is search engine optimization. So with LLMs being introduced and people using those directly to get purchase advice, as well as Google search summaries, which means that publisher sites are just not being visited anymore as much. There's a huge reduction in traffic there. Would you say SEO is dead? And how are marketers optimizing for these new consumer behaviors?
Yes, I think it is. I think for the vast majority of companies, it's not going to be worth investing a lot in this. And of course, there's already a whole new pocket of the internet now talking about AI search engine optimization. How can you make sure that you get picked up by a Perplexity or Google to show up in the AI summary? And what happens there, just if anyone's interested, you basically want to just move down the funnel somewhat, because people searching for very top of the funnel questions that are just about, I have this problem, like what can I do about it? They don't not even aware of any sort of solution, then they wouldn't click on anything. So they will just read the AI summary and probably move on. Whereas if you start moving further down the funnel, what is the best tool for email automation for a startup that's just getting started? You might find something there that you actually click on and give it a try. Okay, fine. But again, for the vast majority of people and companies, there's other things that are going to be more important to focus on. And again, I mean, not to sound repetitive, but I think products and services can now become even more specialized towards specific audiences, because the AI will get even better than what we have right now when it comes to search to help us find what's right for us. So imagine how Google search made it possible to offer a very specific product for small groups of people. Thinking the long tail, you need, let's say, accountancy for a advertising agency of less than 50 people. You can find that on a Google search very easily. Before that, you would go through the yellow pages in your city and you just pick an accountant, right? Because there's not going to be one specialized on creative agencies, because there's not enough of them to build a business. So then Google search makes it viable to serve that niche, because you can suddenly get people from the whole country. And then just think about the next iteration being AI search, where my ChatGPT will know so much about me and how what habits I have around travel, for example, or my daily routines, how active I am, what kind of places I go to. And then if I ask, well, I need new trainers, it will be able to recommend something to me that isn't relevant for 98% of the population. Your product design and product development can become even more tailored to the right audiences. Because then, I mean, especially if you reach a global audience, then any niche could be so big that it's worth building a product around. I don't think that's happening yet. It's still mostly sort of Google Shopping, and you would just type in a term. But that's probably something to aim for. And in the meantime, of course, you've got to be a bit more practical. But that's where it's going. And I certainly think it's not worth investing in new content marketing setups for SEO purposes anymore. And to be honest, as a consumer, I'm quite happy about that, because SEO content is usually terrible. And you search for something on Google and you have to go through 6 articles written by some companies looking like some advice, where really they're just in the end recommending their product. I mean, no thanks. I'd rather just go to ChatGPT and read the summary. It might always be accurate, but it's a lot more efficient.
Absolutely. And I mean, I applaud that coming as quickly as possible because one of my main fears with LLMs is that we can let them generate so much slop of supposed SEO optimized articles that, at least it used to cost somebody's time to write these blog posts that were substantially noise that promoted a certain product and you weren't sure could you trust it or not, was it objective? And my worry was that, well, this is now going to superspeed that because it's not even going to cost somebody's time. So I applaud this change and the hopeful position that SEO will be something of the past to a large degree. I
Well,
look
I
forward
heard
to it.
someone say about a year ago that LLMs will break the internet because they will just flood it with this sort of SEO optimized content. But in reality, what ended up happening is we almost skipped that step because people don't even access that sort of content anymore. I mean, to exaggerate a little bit, but if you look at the drops over the last year in Google Ads clicks, it's an enormous, I think, 40 or 50% drop in just months. So yeah, I don't think we'll break the internet, but it will, the consumer behavior is just changing.
It's amazing how quickly it's changing as well. I mean, AI is changing so much, but that the consumer behavior is keeping up with that is a positive, hopeful sign for me. So moving on to another subject, AI and health innovation. So when it comes to consumer level innovations and the behind the scenes reduction of sludge for healthcare providers, what are you most excited about in AI innovations in health tech?
There's a lot of potential at very different stages of development right now. I think and there's a few examples, and I'm not necessarily deeply immersed in all of them, but certainly when it comes to AI scribes, they're called. So AI tools that will help doctors transcribe meetings or appointments they will have with patients, which currently takes up a vast amount of time, which the AI is getting incredibly good at. So that is probably the tool or the proposition that's most advanced right now. And I think they're getting really good market penetration, at least in certain countries. And it's a very obvious, very practical application, right? Which is why it's quite advanced. And it doesn't sound that exciting. It's not going to get, 21-year-olds joining the health tech world necessarily, but it's incredibly powerful. And anything to do with managing patient data, managing, electronic health records, there's huge potential there to use AI. And then the second one is quite well known is around image recognition used for scans. So we're already seeing a lot of really great results, how the AI might pick up certain things in scans, whether that's MRIs, whatever it might be, enhancing the work of the radiologist rather than replacing. But I have a family member who's a radiologist who I think has to be really careful about how you think about your career development because it will also become sort of more about working with the AI than trying to work against it, which of course is a losing battle. So that's not LLM technology, but AI technology, which is potentially going to have an enormous impact. There's obviously drug development and the more biotech applications. These are huge. I think that still a little bit off to become mainstream. I think what I'm spending most of my time on, what I'm really excited about, is really about coaching and prevention, which we all know prevention is better than cure. It's not economically viable largely in the healthcare system to focus on prevention. And primary care is struggling to be viable economically. And that is the main place right now in the current system where you would expect some sort of preventive health advice. And it's happening to some extent, but it's happening much less than it could. Their focus is more on, doing more physical treatments, I suppose. And even then, it's becoming very, very difficult for primary care practices to find enough doctors because they can earn twice, three times as much going into some of the specialisms. And why is that? Well, because it's really hard to make those kind of value calculations. And so I think that's probably where I see AIs first take over entire functions of provider services. And again, there's going to be enough jobs for primary care physicians. I'm not worried about them running out of work. There's not enough of them anyway. But I think LLMs and tech products, especially over the last years, have shown that they're really good at driving behavior changes, often not in good ways. Getting people addicted to social media, maybe not the best use, but getting people hooked in a healthy way on, say, their sleep data. How many people have you talked to that told you that once they started wearing a sleep tracker, they drink much less alcohol? Great. I think overall that's a good thing. I still like having a glass of wine sometimes, but maybe not right before I go to sleep because I know I'm not going to wake up as fresh. And AI will offer so many more opportunities there to provide much more customized advice and tailor to specific life situations, but also be really motivating. And when it comes to prevention, which I mean I'm very passionate about, I think it's the one big unlock for us to really have a massive impact on people's health, and then of course people's productivity and creativity, whatever you might care about. It's the ultimate sort of meta quality or skill is to just be healthy enough to use your time well. And I think people mostly know what to do, at least broadly. Or you might want to eat more of this, less of that, move more in this way, spend more time doing this. But our environment doesn't always allow us to keep that front of mind. So having your personal coach who roughly understands your habits and your behaviors and maybe some of your weaknesses where, I tend to drop my high intensity workouts sometimes because it's quite hard. Just having a few nudges here and there might be enough to push people over the edge to develop a habit and to actually see quite massive progress. So long answer, but when it comes to what I'm spending my time on, understanding consumer behavior, I think that's potentially a massive unlock that we could see in the next few years.
That's really fascinating. I think for me, one of the interesting behavioral changes that I've observed with LLMs and the way that we can interact with them is they have infinite patience and infinite time. I personally, I take in information about health through podcasts and reading and these items, but it takes a degree of energy to find those things and to find the right ones that are about the specific thing I'm interested in. And even then, you're sort of reading something that isn't necessarily connected to me. So learning about how to exercise more efficiently and how that affects my, how should I observe my heart rate and what can I learn? I do find it much more easier talking to a human. For example, we have a neighbor who he's run an Ironman and done all sorts of pretty extreme things. I am nowhere, not even close to what he does, but he's really inspiring. And when I'm trying to improve on something, I do sometimes ask him to just talk through how does this work? What exactly does heart rate mean? And I could find an article online about it and read it, but there's something about the dialogue that lets me go deeper and for me to understand it better and for me to remember it better. And I find I'm not going to bother him every day about my heart rate, right? He only has so much time. But with these tools, I don't mind bothering an AI because it is patient and it has an infinite amount of time to answer my questions and talk to me. And I think that consumer behavior is changing, that I'm more willing to say, well, I'm not sure about this. Can you explain this? So asking questions and then diving deeper into information and learning is something that I find is really fascinating, assuming that we can get the hallucinations right, that it's not telling me something that's not true, assuming that it's safe. That is an encouraging element to me for consumer behavior and consumer change. So getting those nudges as well as going a little bit deeper in terms of that knowledge.
I mean, it certainly depends on the type of people that we're speaking about, right? Certain
Yeah.
people are very committed and they want to learn and understand how everything works and make decisions on the basis of that. Others would rather just follow the advice they're being given, currently by a doctor. That's not always very specific, so they might appreciate something a bit more specific, but generally prefer the sort of the menu laid out. That can be catered for. I think one thing I would add to what you said about the LLM being more patient with its time, it also has one massive advantage compared to the sort of online health influencer world, which is it doesn't need to gather attention because it
Hmm.
already has your attention. Whereas if you're looking at how you're going to be popular as a health influencer, how you're going to have a reach is you have to be very pointed with your insights. You have to maybe be a bit more extreme than what is reasonable. Whereas if you go to an LLM, it will tell you, look, just try and sleep more because that's really the most useful piece of advice. But you're not going to become the next biggest health influencer by saying that. Or, I mean, I'm not that nobody is saying that, but it's a lot easier to find extreme answers because that's how people have to compete. They're just looking at the incentives. That's completely different for the LLM. So I think in that sense, it can be.
That's a really good point. That's great. And so, do you have any other views on what would help these AI driven health startups that are beginning to do this great work? Advice on what they should do to truly succeed and scale?
So one thing I would come back to is thinking about the different audiences and how willing they are to do the work. Whereas, for some people, it's useful to go into the chat bot and start asking, and that there'll be versions of that are also connected with your health records. So then it's easier to just say, hey, by the way, look at my last couple of blood tests, routine blood tests. Are there any trends that you noticed that I should try and counteract with my behavior? And then you can dive into it in more detail. But I don't think that interface is necessarily going to work for everyone. And I know chat has unlocked the popularity of LLMs to a massive degree, but there's going to be another iteration of that, which is coming back to some of the other interfaces that we've already established, but just being powered by AI. So whether that's, quite visual apps or, sort of other sort of online platforms or however they might want to do it, I think that's what we need to figure out is, for example, I think that when it comes to health coaching, it might actually be much more useful to have a dashboard and have some charts and maybe a little snippet of AI generated text that really points out, hey, this is powerful about what you're doing, and maybe this you could do better, but make it more visual for people to follow their progress or tick off certain goals they've set for themselves. And there we haven't really seen that much innovation yet. And I think there'll be people working on prevention LLMs, and it's already happening to some extent. But then there'll be people who need to work on the interfaces and really building the human machine interface, right? The connection between our daily behavior and what the technology can do underlying. So I think that for me is one focus is make sure you're building something really usable. And then there's other factors that are very particular to the healthcare industry that, eventually somebody will be paying for this who's not the end consumer, because most of the money in the healthcare system right now is just routed through various sort of intermediaries, whether that's the government or insurance plans or direct provider relationships. There's a direct to consumer element, which I think is really powerful to get started and to get initial users, get initial traction. And then eventually you start tapping into some of these more complex players in the system. So finding the right sequence for that go-to-market strategy is actually quite complex. And it's really important for companies that want to reach a mainstream scale in that market. But it's hopefully already happening. And I think there's a lot of room for startups in this space with AI, even more so than it has been in the last 10 years. So I think anyone who's interested in doing something that really helps people, that has a big technology element, then I think it's a great place to go into. If you're willing to face some of the headaches of dealing with a highly inefficient industry that's very risk averse. But other than that, there's a lot that will be happening there.
That's great. I love the idea of the evolution of these tools being hyper personalized AI driven dashboards. That's a really great insight. Felix, I always like to ask at the end, what advice would you give someone who's just starting out as an entrepreneur or a marketer in today's landscape?
I think I would come back to what I hinted at earlier, which is knowing where to stick to the sort of good old truths, such as, you need to understand your customer's need, and then find a way to directly address that need, however it is. That's never going to change. And then there's other areas where you need to just embrace the new technology as quickly as possible. So, you play around with the tools and stay up to date, and it's going to give you an advantage to be early, as long as we still keep in mind the fundamentals of building companies or building products, or connecting with people. Ultimately, you just have to understand who they are, what goes through their mind, what the issue is, and then sort of find a way to address it directly. And the technology is a tool in the end. I think it makes that more efficient to some extent in the right areas. And so I think it's fun to stay up to date with that, but still understanding the foundations of it too, I think is really important.
That's really great. Felix, thank you so much for your time today. This has been super inspiring and yeah, really great. And yeah, we should do it again soon. Thank you so much.
I love to. Thanks for having me.